Chapter 1. The Giantess of Dry Creek. The afternoon sun lay heavy over Dry Creek, turning the dusty main street into a ribbon of gold. Heat shimmered off the rooftops, the smell of baked earth mingling with the tang of horse sweat and coal smoke. Wagon wheels creaked, a dog barked lazily from the shade of the blacksmith shop, and the saloon doors swung open with the rhythm of men going in to drink away their troubles. Marigold Kane walked down the boardwalk, boots thudding softly against the sun-bleached planks. Her shadow stretched long in the dying light, longer still because she towered over most men in town. At 7'3", she was a walking spectacle in every corner of the frontier, broad-shouldered, strong-backed, with hands that could lift a hay bale like a child's toy. She carried herself with a calm, practiced stillness that kept most folks from getting too close. A pair of ranch boys paused mid-step to stare. One elbowed the other, whispering something with a smirk before ducking away on the brim of his hat. Mari kept walking, the brim of her own Stetson tipped low enough to hide her eyes. She'd learned long ago that silence was a better answer than feeding the fire of small-town gossip. Still, she could feel the stares. Always the stares. Outside the general store, old Mrs. Hilburn offered a tight smile. "Afternoon, Mari," she said, polite as ever, but with that wary edge that folks took on when they didn't know whether to treat her like a neighbor or a curiosity. "Ma'am." Mari tipped her hat and stepped past, pushing open the heavy door with her shoulder. The bell above jingled faintly as she went inside. The store was cool, dim, smelling of flour sacks and lamp oil. She moved between the shelves, collecting nails, a tin of coffee, and a spool of twine. As she reached for a jar of molasses, the murmur of conversation outside caught her ear. Low, male voices, punctuated by laughter that carried a certain cruel tone she knew too well. "Big as a damn grizzly," one voice drawled. "Reckoned she could wrestle one." Another chuckled. "Ain't no man ever gonna." Mari's jaw tightened. She set the jar in her basket without turning, without giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. She had spent her whole life hearing variations of the same thing. Too tall, too strong, too much. By the time she stepped out again, the men had moved on. Only the sound of their spurs lingered in the street. She adjusted her hat and started toward the hitching post where her big roan gelding waited. The gelding, Dustfoot, was one of the few creatures in the territory she didn't have to stoop to look at. He flicked an ear toward her, and she laid a hand on his warm neck. That's when she noticed the stranger. He sat astride a black horse a few doors down, watching the street with the quiet patience of a man who'd seen his share of trouble. Lean, broad across the shoulders, his coat dusty from the trail, he had a sun-brown face shadowed by a low-slung hat. But with his eyes, steady, assessing and fixed right on her, that gave Mari pause. Most men either avoided her gaze or looked at her like some sideshow curiosity. This one didn't flinch, didn't smirk. He simply studied her, like a man taking a measure of a fine horse before a hard ride. Mari found herself holding his stare a heartbeat longer than she meant to before turning to check Dustfoot's cinch. The stranger swung down from his saddle, his spurs giving a slow, deliberate jingle as he crossed toward the saloon. When he passed within a few paces, he tipped his hat in her direction. "Ma'am." His voice was low, smooth, carrying that slow drawl of the high plains. Not mockery, not pity, just a greeting, plain and respectful. She nodded, the smallest dip of her chin. "Stranger." He smiled faintly, a quick, unreadable thing, before stepping through the saloon doors. Mari stood a moment longer, hands still resting on Dustfoot's mane. She could hear the piano starting up inside, the rattle of glasses, the rising hum of voices. Somewhere beyond the town, a coyote yipped at the edge of the prairie. It was probably nothing, just another drifter passing through. And yet she couldn't shake the way his eyes had met hers, steady, without judgment, as if he saw something in her that the rest of Dry Creek had missed. Chapter 2. A Saloon Standoff. The sun had dipped low, painting the plains in shades of copper and rose. Dry Creek's main street had taken on its evening hum. Boots clomping up boardwalks, wagon wheels rattling toward home, and the saloon piano starting on a lazy tune that rolled through the open double doors. Marigold Kane hadn't planned on stepping inside that night. She preferred her whiskey at home, away from the prying eyes and sharp tongues that too often found her. But Dustfoot had thrown a shoe on the trail back from the cane ranch, and she'd stopped in town to wait for the blacksmith to finish. Waiting, she told herself, was easier in a chair than standing out on the street, looking like a sentinel no one had asked for. The saloon was warm and thick with the smell of tobacco, whiskey, and sweat. Lamps threw golden light over the bar, over the card tables, over the crowd of ranch hands, drifters, and a few painted girls drifting between them. Floorboards groaned under the shuffle of boots and the occasional stomp when someone laughed too hard. Mari stepped through, ducking slightly under the doorway as she always had to, and headed for a corner table where she could see the room without being swallowed by it. She just settled into her chair when she caught sight of the stranger from earlier, the man on the black horse. He sat at the far end of the bar, one elbow resting casually on the polished wood, a half-empty glass in front of him. His eyes tracked the room without hurry, lingering just long enough on each man to let them know they'd been seen. He didn't wear his gun like a decoration. It was tied down low, close to his hand, and something in his manner said he knew how to use it. She turned her attention to her drink, but it wasn't long before trouble started brewing. 3 ranch hands swaggered in, still loud from whatever they'd been drinking before. One spotted her almost immediately. "Well, if it ain't the cane giantess," he said, loud enough to carry across the saloon. His friend snickered, already feeding off the attention. Mari kept her gaze steady on her glass. She'd been through this dance before. Ignore it, and it might pass. Mari Kane. Another drawled, stepping closer. "Reckon you're still hunting for a man tall enough to reach your lips?" More laughter. Chairs scraped as a few patrons leaned in to watch. The piano faltered and went quiet. One of them, a red-faced fellow with too much whiskey in his breath, leaned on her table. "Tell you what, sweetheart, I'm willing to try, if you don't mind bending down a bit." He didn't finish. The scrape of a chair came from the bar, followed by the slow, deliberate jingle of spurs. The stranger was walking toward them, his steps unhurried, his expression calm in a way that felt more dangerous than a scowl. "Evening," he said, voice low, eyes fixed on a red-faced man. "You boys in the habit of both errand, ladies trying to have a quiet drink." "This ain't your business, friend," one of them muttered, squaring his shoulders. The stranger's gaze didn't waver. "Looks like it is now." There was a tension in the air, the kind that made men shift their hands closer to their belts. Mari felt it ripple through the room. The hush that came. Red-Face gave a tight laugh, but it sounded thin. "You fixin' to fight over her?" "Not fixin' to fight," the stranger said evenly. "Just fixin' to make sure you walk away before you wish you had." Something in his tone, calm, unshaken, absolutely certain, made the 3 men hesitate. After a beat, one muttered a curse and jerked his head toward the door. They left in a shuffle of boots and muttered insults, the tension bleeding from the room in their wake. The stranger turned to Mari, tipping his hat slightly. "Ma'am." She studied him, trying to read what was in his eyes. Not pity. She knew the look of that too well. This was something else. Respect, maybe, or curiosity. "Stranger," she said, her voice as even as she could make it. He gave the faintest ghost of a smile before heading back to his place at the bar, leaving her with the clink of his spurs still in her ears and the uneasy feeling that he'd shifted something in her world without even trying. Chapter 3. The Ranch Fire. The wind came in hot from the south that evening, carrying the smell of dust and something darker, the faint, acrid tang of smoke. Marigold Kane had been hauling hay bales to the upper pasture when she spotted it. A low, angry smear of black rising from the direction of the barn. Her heart jolted. In the dry stretch of August, a single spark could take the whole ranch with it. "Damn it," she hissed, kicking Dustfoot into a gallop. Hooves thundered over the baked earth, the heat rising off the ground in waves. By the time she crested the last rise, the barn was already half-shrouded in choking gray. The flames licked up the drywood like hungry tongues, the crackle loud over the wind. Horses screamed inside. Somewhere in the chaos, the old milk cow bellowed. She leapt from the saddle, tearing the bandana from around her neck, and tie it over her mouth. No time to think, only act. Then, Out of the smoke, another rider appeared. Black horse, lean frame, hat pulled low. The stranger, Colton Hayes. "Need a hand?" he called, voice muffled but steady. "Get the damn doors open." Mari shouted back. They hit the big double doors together, the heat blistering their skin even from this distance. The hinges groaned, the latch gave, and the first of the horses burst out in a panic, nearly knocking Colton off his feet. He caught a bridle, turning the animal toward the open pasture. Mari darted inside, eyes stinging, to cut loose the rest. Colton was right behind her, moving with the ease of a man who'd been around fire before, quick, efficient, no wasted motion. "Back left stall's blocked," she yelled over the roar. "I'll handle it." She didn't question him. Together they pushed the last terrified mare through the doors. Mari could feel the heat at her back, like a living thing, chasing her out into the fading daylight. Colton stumbled from the smoke, coughing, leading the old milk cow by its halter. He gave the rope a sharp tug, sending her lumbering toward safety. They didn't stop moving until the last animal was clear. Then they turned to the fire. It was a losing battle, but neither of them fought like they knew it. Bucket after bucket from the pump, soaking the smaller shed to keep it from catching, stamping out sparks in the grass with their boots. Sweat poured down their faces, mixing with soot until they were both streaked black. By the time the barn collapsed inward with a groan and a shower of sparks, the worst of it had passed. The smaller structures were safe. The animals were alive. That would have to be enough. Mari bent forward, hands braced on her knees, lungs burning. She could taste the bitter tang of smoke on her tongue. "You all right?" Colton's voice came from just behind her. She straightened, meeting his gaze through the haze. His eyes, pale as creek water, held no trace of fear, only the kind of calm you earned after staring down danger more than once. "Could have been worse," she said, pulling the bandana from her face. "Could have lost the whole spread." He nodded, glancing toward the glowing embers. "You move fast. Save what mattered." Mari gave a humorless snort. "Ain't my first fire." He studied her for a moment longer, and there was something in his look that unsettled her more than the flames had, a quiet, unspoken respect. The sun was sinking behind the ridge now, the sky streaked with orange and violet. Smoke curled up into the cooling air, and in the sudden stillness, the distant yip of a coyote carried across the open land. Colton shifted his hat back on his head. "Suppose I should be heading on," he said, though his tone didn't carry much conviction. Mari found herself saying, "Stay, at least till the animals settle." His mouth curved just slightly. "If you're sure." She nodded once, and as they stood there, side by side in the dying light, the weight of the day hanging between them, Mari realized that maybe, just maybe, this stranger had no intention of passing through after all. Chapter 4, Secrets in the Sagebrush. Morning broke over the Kane Ranch in shades of peach and pale gold, the prairie stretching endless under the sky. The air was crisp after the fire, carrying the scent of damp ash and sun-warmed sagebrush. Mari had been up before dawn, checking every fence line for stray embers, her long strides eating the distance between posts. She thought she was alone until the sound of hoofbeats drifted over the hills, slow, steady, unhurried. Colton Hayes rode up alongside her, his black gelding stepping easy in the soft dirt. He looked as though the wind and trail belonged to him, hat tipped low, one hand loose on the reins. "Fence mending?" he asked. "Embers will travel if you let 'em," Mari said, testing the tension of the wire with a gloved hand. "Last thing I need is to lose the east pasture." He dismounted without a word, looping his reins over a post. When she arched a brow, he gave a faint shrug. Two hands made quicker work. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the leather, the whine of the wire, and the occasional sigh of wind through the sage. It was Colton who finally broke it. "Town talks about you, you know." Mari snorted without looking up. "Town talks about everybody." "True." He twisted a length of wire, his movements easy, precise. "Difference is, you let it stick to you." Her head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "I don't let—" She stopped herself, jaw tightening. She went back to the fence, shoving the staple into the post harder than necessary. Colton leaned on the rail, watching her for a long moment. You think I didn't hear it last night? In the saloon? Hell, I've heard men talk like that in half the towns I passed through. But you, he paused, his voice lowering. You've been hearing it your whole life, haven't you? The wind carried the faint scent of sage between them. Mari's hand stilled on the post. She didn't answer right away. It was easy to keep her back turned, to stare out over the endless stretch of prairie rather than meet the steady blue of his eyes. Since I was 14, she said finally, her voice low, since I shot up taller than my brothers and stronger than my pa. They started with names. Then came the looks. By the time I was 20, every man in Dry Creek had decided what I was worth, and it wasn't much. She drew in a slow breath, the air dry in her lungs. My ma used to say God made me for work, not for courting, not for a home or children. That ain't cruel. She meant it as truth, and I've lived with it long enough to believe it. Her fingers worried at the wire, though there was nothing left to fix. Colton didn't move closer, but his voice came quieter still. They're all blind. Mari turned then, searching his face for sarcasm, for the smirk that always followed words like that. But there was none, just that unflinching, level gaze, like he was speaking plain fact. The wind tugged at her hat brim, sending a few loose strands of hair across her cheek. You don't know me, she said, though it came out softer than she'd meant. Not yet, he allowed, the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. But I know what I see, and it ain't what they see. For a moment, neither of them looked away. Somewhere far off, a coyote yipped, the sound carrying to the open land. Mari broke the gaze first, turning back to the fence. We should finish this line before the sun's high. Sure, Colton said, though there was something in his tone that told her he wasn't done with the conversation. Not by a long shot. They worked on, the sage-scented wind weaving between them like a promise unspoken. Chapter 5, Bullets at Sunset. The day had been quiet, the kind of quiet that set Mari's teeth on edge. Out here, trouble never announced itself with shout. It came on silent boots, the way a rattler slid through grass before striking. She was in the west pasture, driving a small herd toward the water trough, when she saw them. 4 riders on a ridge, silhouettes sharp against the dying light. They weren't moving fast, but the way they sat their saddles told her they weren't strangers passing through. Rustlers had been sniffing around Dry Creek for weeks, and she knew the Kane brand was worth good money at the stockyard across the state line. The horses shifted nervously as the riders descended, their shadows stretching long in the gold of the setting sun. Mari's hand went to the rifle in the scabbard on Dustfoot's saddle. Before she could decide whether to ride forward or double back, the thump of hoofbeats came from the east. Colton appeared, his black gelding eating up the distance, the light catching on the steel at his hip. He reined in beside her, his gaze following hers to the men approaching. You know them? He asked. Don't need to, Mari said, her voice low. They're here to take what's mine. The riders fanned out as they closed in, one with a red bandana covering his lower face. Evening, Miss Kane, he called mock friendly. Figure it's time you donated a few head to folks who need 'em more. Mari's jaw tightened. These cattle ain't for charity. Turn around while you still can. The man's eyes flicked to Colton. And who's this? Your hired hand. Colton's voice was calm, almost lazy. Friend, who's got a short temper for men who don't mind their manners. The leader laughed, but it didn't touch his eyes. His hand dropped toward his revolver. The air seemed to tighten between them, the stillness before lightning strikes. Colton's gaze didn't waver. Mari, keep the herd moving, he murmured without looking at her. But she wasn't the type to turn her back on a fight. Not likely. The leader's hand twitched, and the world snapped into motion. The crack of gunfire shattered the calm, sending the cattle bawling in panic. Mari swung her rifle up, the stock snug against her shoulder, and fired. One rustler yelped, clutching his arm. Colton's revolver barked twice in quick succession, forcing the other 2 to scatter. The leader charged forward, spurring his horse hard. Mari wheeled Dustfoot to intercept, the ground trembling under the pounding of hooves. She fired again, the shot kicking up dirt inches from his mount's front legs. The animal reared, screaming, and the man fought to stay seated. Colton closed in from the side, his revolver aimed steady. "Drop it." The man's eyes darted between them. Mari's towering figure, rifle level without a tremor, and Colton's unblinking aim. He spat into the dirt and jerked his chin toward his men. "We'll be back." "Not if you know what's good for you," Mari said. They rode off into the deepening dusk, their silhouettes swallowed by the prairie. For a long moment, only the sound of the cattle's uneasy shifting filled the air. Mari lowered her rifle, her breath slowing, the burn of adrenaline still hot in her veins. Colton holstered his revolver and looked at her, the faintest curve at one corner of his mouth. "You handle yourself well." "Didn't have much choice," she said, though a flicker of warmth lit in her chest at the note in his voice. Not surprise, not condescension. Admiration. The sun slid behind a ridge, the sky painted in fire and ash. In the fading light, Mari realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. It wasn't just her land and stock Colton had been protecting. It was her, and for the first time in years, the thought didn't make her bristle. It made her feel seen. Chapter 6. The Kiss That Changed Everything. The prairie night was quiet after the rustlers rode off. Almost too quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Mari and Colton had driven the cattle back to the corral under a blood-red moon. The only sound the soft clink of tack and the slow, steady breaths of tired horses. Now, the barnyard lay bathed in silver light, the charred skeleton of the old barn still standing like a ghost against the stars. Mari hopped down from Dustfoot, the ache in her legs a reminder of the fight and the ride. She busied herself with checking the gates, avoiding Colton's eyes. She wasn't sure why her heart was thudding the way it was. The danger was past, yet she felt more unsettled now than when the bullets were flying. Behind her, the sound of boots in dirt drew closer. "You take a graze?" Colton's voice was low, threaded with concern. She glanced down at her arm where the fabric of her shirt was torn, a thin line of blood welling along her bicep. "It's nothing," she said, moving toward the tack room. Colton's hand closed gently around her wrist, halting her. His touch was firm but not forceful, the warmth of his fingers at odds with the cool night air. "Sit," he said quietly, nodding toward a hay bale. Mari hesitated, every instinct telling her to shake him off, to handle it herself like she always had. But something in his eyes, that steady, unflinching focus, made her obey. He knelt in front of her, pulling a small tin from his saddlebag. The scent of pine resin and clean leather rose as he opened it. He worked in silence, dabbing the salve onto the cut with calloused fingers, careful as though she were made of glass. "You're too used to doing everything alone," he murmured, not looking up. Mari gave a humorless chuckle. "That's what happens when folks decide you don't need anybody." Colton tied a strip of clean cloth around her arm and sat back on his heels. "And you believe him?" She shrugged, but the movement felt heavier than it should, seemed easier than hoping for something that had never come. Finally, he lifted his gaze to hers. "You're wrong about that." There was again that steady conviction, like he'd staked his claim on the truth and wasn't about to be moved. Mari wanted to look away, to laugh it off, but the words lodged deep. The air between them was thick with the scent of hay and wood smoke, the distant howl of a coyote riding the breeze. Colton stood slowly, and for a moment she thought he'd step back. Instead, he reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered just long enough to send a shiver down her spine. "You think you're too much," he said softly, "but I think you're just enough for the right man." Her breath caught. He leaned down, slow enough she could have stopped him, but she didn't. His lips found hers, warm, steady, tasting faintly of dust and whiskey. It wasn't a desperate kiss, or a tentative one. It was deliberate, like he'd made up his mind a long time ago, and was finally collecting on a promise. For a heartbeat, Mari froze. Then the walls she'd held for years cracked, and she kissed him back, her hands finding the rough line of his jaw. The barnyard, the rustlers, the years of keeping her heart under lock. All of it faded beneath the simple truth of his mouth on hers. When they parted, the world seemed sharper somehow, the stars brighter, the night air cooler against her skin. Mari cleared her throat, her voice steadier than she felt. "Colton, I ain't breeding material." Never have been. He smiled, just enough to crease the corners of his eyes. We'll see about that. The coyotes called again, the wind shifting through the sage, and Mari realized something she hadn't dared before. She wanted to believe him. Chapter 7, Winter in Their Arms. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the high country in biting winds and heavy skies. Snow settled over Dry Creek in uneven drifts, muffling the sound of land. The ranch, usually a place of creaking leather and whinnying horses, grew quiet, save for the occasional groan of the barn timbers or the distant call of a hawk. Mari had always faced winter the same way she faced everything else, alone, head down, shoulders squared. But this year was different. This year, Colton Hayes was here. From the moment the first snow fell, he moved into her days as naturally as if he'd always belonged. They hauled feed together when the wind cut like a knife, their breath hanging in white clouds. They rode fence lines in the pale blue light before dawn, the frost crunching under their horses' hooves. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire in the main room, boots stretched toward the warmth, trading stories in the easy silence of people who didn't need to fill every space with words. Colton had a way of making the long nights seem shorter. He'd sharpen her knives without asking, patch her gloves on the leather tour, and somehow, without her noticing, he made the Kane Ranch feel less like a fortress and more like a home. One night in late January, the wind was howling hard enough to rattle the shutters. Mari had just banked the fire when she felt his arms slide around her from behind. "Cold night," he murmured against her hair. "Colder than I like," she admitted, leaning back into his warmth. They stood like that for a long moment, watching the firelight flicker on the walls. Mari could feel his heartbeat against her spine, steady and sure, and it struck her how much he'd come to rely on that rhythm, as if it anchored her in a way nothing else had. It was in moments like these that the old doubts sometimes crept in. She'd spent her life believing she was too much for any man to want for keeps. But Colton didn't flinch from her size, her strength, or her stubborn streak. If anything, he seemed to love her more for it. February rolled in with clear skies and deeper snow. Mari began to notice little changes in herself, a tiredness she couldn't shake, a queasiness in the mornings that made her skip breakfast. At first, she chalked up to winter weariness, the kind that settled into your bones after months of hard work in the cold. It was Colton who noticed first. "You've been pale," he said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Winter'll do that," she replied, brushing him off. He gave her a long, searching look, but didn't press the matter. It wasn't until the first hint of spring, when the snow had started to melt in patches along the fence posts, that the truth hit her. She was late, weeks late. The realization stopped her in her tracks one morning in the kitchen, the coffee cup cooling in her hands. Her first instinct was disbelief. It couldn't be. She'd been told all her life she wasn't built for breeding. That was the one truth she'd never thought to question. When Colton came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots, she must have looked shaken, because he stopped short. "Mari, what is it?" She met his eyes, her throat suddenly tight. "Colton, I think," she swallowed hard, "I think I'm going to have a baby." For a moment, he simply stared at her. Then the slowest, warmest smile she'd ever seen spread across his face. "Guess we prove him wrong," he said softly, stepping forward to pull her into his arms. Mari buried her face against his chest, the scent of leather and hay in him grounding her as the shock gave way to something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Outside, the snow still lay deep, but in her heart, spring had already come. Chapter 8. A new dawn over Dry Creek. The first light of morning crept over the plains, washing the land in pale gold. The prairie grass glistened with dew, and the scent of sagebrush rose fresh in the cool air. From the porch of the Kane Ranch house, Mari stood with her hands resting over the gentle swell of her belly, watching the horizon come alive. Colton stepped out beside her, a steaming mug in one hand, his other reaching to rest at the small of her back. He was shirt-sleeved despite the chill, his hair still damp from washing, and he looked every inch the man who had worked the land his whole life, though she knew his story was a lot more complicated than that. They didn't speak at first. Out here, words weren't always necessary. The land spoke for itself, the distant whinny of a horse, the soft clink of a windmill turning, the faint coyote call carrying from the far hills. Mari's gaze traveled over the pasture, where the cattle moved slow and content under the waking sky. The rebuilt barn stood proud and new, its fresh timber glowing in the light, a monument to what they'd saved together. "Looks different, don't it?" Colton said quietly. She smiled faintly. "The land?" He shook his head, eyes sliding to her. "You." She gave a soft snort, but there was no sting in it. "Maybe." She glanced back at the barn. "Guess I ain't the same woman you met that day in Dry Creek." "That woman was worth knowing," he said, stepping closer until their shoulders brushed. "This woman's worth keeping." Mari looked at him then, and for a moment the rest of the world faded. The doubt she'd carried like a second skin all her life had been worn thin over the months, replaced by something steadier, warmer. It wasn't that the town had stopped talking. She still caught the glances when they walked in together. But now she didn't care, because when Colton looked at her, he didn't see the woman the others whispered about. He saw her. And now, soon enough, there'd be someone else who would, too. She rested her hand over her belly again, feeling the flutter she still wasn't used to. "Never thought I'd see the day," she murmured. Colton's hand covered hers, warm and strong. "Told you we'd see about that." She laughed softly, the sound carried away on the breeze. Below them, the town of Dry Creek was already stirring. Smoke curling from chimneys, the sound of hammers in the blacksmith shop, a wagon rattling toward the general store. People had begun tipping their hats when they passed, their eyes different now. Not all of them, but enough. The fire, the rustlers, the quiet way Colton had stood by her through it all, it had changed things. They stayed like that a while longer, leaning against the porch railing, watching the light chase the shadows from the land. Eventually, Colton turned to her, his voice low but certain. "This is home now," he said. Mari met his gaze. "For both of us?" He smiled, slow, sure, the way he had the first night they'd really talked. "For all of us." The sun broke fully over the ridge then, spilling gold across the plains, the barn, the house, and over them, standing side by side. The wind carried the scent of sage and new grass, the promise of season just beginning. For the first time in her life, Mari Kane didn't wonder if she was enough. She knew it, and as Colton pressed a kiss to her temple, the life growing inside her shifted gently, like it knew it too. Dry Creek had seen many dawns, but this one was hers. The sun was sinking low, spilling molten gold across the open plains. Wind stirred the tall grass, carrying with it the warm scent of sagebrush and the faint strains of saloon piano drifting from Dry Creek. Horses grazed in the distance, their silhouettes framed against the burning horizon. Mari stood at the fence line, one hand resting over the curve of her belly, watching the light fade. The land she'd fought for, bled for, spread before her, safe, quiet, and hers. Bootsteps crunched softly in the dust behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Colton. His arm slid around her waist, pulling her gently against him. For a moment, they just stood there, breathing the same air, watching the same sun sink toward the far hills. "It's been a long trail," he murmured. She glanced up at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "Worth every mile." Colton kissed her forehead, lingering there, the brim of his hat shadowing them both. "You're everything they said you weren't," he said quietly. "And more." Her eyes shone, the words settling deep. She squeezed his hand. "And you're everything I didn't know I needed." The last of the sunlight dipped below the ridge, leaving the world bathed in twilight. Together, they turned toward the house, toward a future neither of them had dared dream before, while the wind whispered to the sage, carrying their laughter into the night.